in fact, at the first opportunity, he's going to not only eliminate political opposition, but he's going to accrue to himself not just the trappings, but the titles of autocracy. And then he dies of unrelated causes. He dies of illness. China really doesn't manage to have political stability again for decades.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn, and I come to you from the heart of Red America, a blue dot inside it, in Nashville, Tennessee, a long way from Beijing, my former home of 20 years, and even longer away from Joburg, Johannesburg, where I was born, just around the block and a month after Elon Musk. I realize that I keep on mentioning this in podcasts in my introduction, and the reason is just to point out that I have a born and bred understanding of various influential racists and fascists of my generation and background. But today, we're going back 100 years or so in history, and my guest is James, or Jay Carter, historian and author of the recent Champions Day, about a horse race day in Shanghai in 1941 that, as Jay puts it, revealed the history and foreshadowed the future of Shanghai. Jay has also written Heart of Buddha, Heart of China, The Life of Tanxu, a 20th century monk, and Creating a Chinese Harbin Nationalism in an International City, 1916 to 1932. He's also the author of the excellent This Week in China's History column, which started at the now defunct China Project, of which I was the editor-in-chief. Happily, the column still thrives and is now on the Sinica feed, connected to my old friend Kaiser Kuo's podcast. Jay is also Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at St. Joseph's University, Philadelphia. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Jay.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me open our discussion this way by reading a brief excerpt from one of your This Week in China's History columns. Let's imagine it this way. A man is successful, powerful, and important. He's made his way to the top of his field, accumulating personal loyalty and more than a few enemies on his way to becoming one of the most recognizable names in the country. Unexpectedly, he decides he wants to be president. He defeats the obvious candidate, the one everyone assumed would be president, and gains the top office. But then things don't go as planned. He has never worked well within institutions designed to limit executive power, and the authoritarian tactics that had sustained him in his previous positions aren't suited to democracy. His popularity wanes. Rivals appear poised to replace him. Frustrated by limits on his power, he thwarts the democratic process and places his own interests and fate ahead of the country's. I am, of course, talking about Yuan Shikai. Who did you think I meant? Anyway, Jay, I'm just going to leave that hanging there for a moment, and we'll return to it later. But let's talk about Yuan Shikai. Let's set the context for his rise. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about China at the end of the 19th century, as the Qing dynasty was growing increasingly sclerotic and corrupt and incompetent and beset on all sides by exploitative colonial powers. What was the environment that our story begins in?
Yeah, all those things, corrupt, sclerotic. The remarkable thing when you talk about the Qing dynasty in the late 19th century is that it survived as long as it did. So beset by enemies from outside, it was fractured from within. And a lot of these movements from within were trying to find ways to strengthen the Qing dynasty to handle the threats from without. So nationalism becomes a huge issue. And of course, the Qing dynasty is run by the Manchu. So the Qing is really looking at challenges from all directions. And the idea that it didn't fall in the 1840s and it didn't fall in the 1850s or the 1860s or the 1880s, at any moment, people really were predicting its demise. It's kind of testament to many of the people who were helping to run the show. And one of those people was Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai was a military man. He was a general. He was one of the people who was kind of instrumental in the Qing dynasty, both in the corruption. I mean, we should be clear about that. But he also helped the dynasty to stave off threats and to reform itself in an effort to stay afloat. He retired in 1898. He retires in 1898 as the kind of the power of Cixi, the Empress Dowager, is declining.
And he had been reporting, in modern parlance, reporting to her, had he?
Indeed, he had. So he retires, and the dynasty is still spiraling down. So, I mean, 1898, that's a moment when it looks like the dynasty might try to reform itself, but then the reforms don't happen and it spirals further out of control. And all of this is in the context of, if I can set Yuan Shikai and the Qing aside, this is all happening. Meanwhile, there are revolutionary or reformist forces and revolutionary forces inside China, most famously led by Sun Yat-sen, the sort of cosmopolitan, Western-educated, medically trained, charismatic fundraiser figure who kind of is the spearhead to these anti-Qing forces that are going to, in their estimation, lead China into both a modern world and one that's going to cast off its own imperial or colonial overlords, the Manchus, but also help it to stand up to the imposed threats from Western powers, and China is going to be able to take its place alongside the family of nations. So this is where Sun Yat-sen has been working in the 1890s into the 1910s. And that's where China is, and I should say the Qing dynasty. And those of you in my racket, you'll use Qing and China sometimes interchangeably, recognizing, of course, that you can get very upset if you say that to the wrong person. But the Qing Empire, the Chinese state, is kind of ready to fall at any moment. And then, of course, what's surprising is that the moment that it does fall is the moment no one is expecting. And so at this time, Sun Yat-sen is leading the revolutionary movement. So he's in the United States at the time.
And he's leading the party that becomes the Kuomintang, the KMT, which eventually loses to the communists in the Civil War and flees to Taiwan. But at this point, he's in the US.
Exactly right. He's actually left China because a couple of his attempts at revolution hadn't gone off the way he'd hoped. So he decides to go abroad to raise support from overseas Chinese. And so he's in the United States. So the story goes, he's riding a train from Denver to Kansas City when he reads in the newspaper that a bomb has gone off in the Russian concession in Wuhan, which then causes the revolution to kind of go off half-cocked. They realize that if they don't seize their opportunity at this moment, they're going to have to rebuild their energies for a long time. So the revolution starts. Sun Yat-sen is out of the country. He kind of works to do things to get back. The other main player, and the person you were asking about, Yuan Shikai. So Yuan Shikai, remember, he had retired, kind of been forced to retire more than a decade earlier. He's recalled by the Qing dynasty to help put down the rebellion.
And how old is he at this point?
At this point, I should check that. He's not a young man. He's born in I don't have the dates right in front of me, but he's not a young man. He's in his 50s or something like that. So he's recalled to fight against the rebellion, which he does. I mean, he fights against Sun Yat-sen and his forces, but meanwhile, I should say Sun Yat-sen's forces. Sun Yat-sen is not back in the country at this point, but he fights against the revolutionaries. But meanwhile, he's working behind the scenes to come up with a deal that's going to enable him to support the revolution, to arrange for the abdication of the monarchy and replace it with himself in charge of the new government. So that's the deal he arranges. He decides that he's going to switch sides so that he'll help the revolution succeed, and in exchange, he's going to take over as the president of the new republic. When the republic is declared in January of 1912, Sun Yat-sen is the provisional president, but then a few months later, Yuan Shikai is the one who becomes the first president of the republic, and that's where he is in 1912.
So what does he do as president? How does he begin governing? Because the simplistic image of Yuan that I, started the podcast with, obviously making some kind of comparisons, Donald Trump. As you write, you fed into that simplistic image with your opening paragraphs of that article, and that obscures some positive contributions, including economic development, educational reforms. And at the time of his presidency, he was a genuinely popular figure. You say even compared to George Washington for his role in founding China's republic. So how were those, the first months and years of his rule?
Yeah, it sits uneasily. So when he comes into power, there is a provisional constitution, which he's protecting as president of the republic. That constitution it's guaranteeing equal protection of person and property under the law. It's guaranteeing freedom of assembly and worship. It's guaranteeing the franchise to all men over the age of 21, paying a certain amount of taxes. It comes out to about 10% of the population, and that's an important consideration because the Kuomintang that we'll talk about in a bit, they had really come to power on the idea that they would support both more progressive economic policies and more inclusive political policies, but that gets kind of shunted to the side. And there are going to be elections that are going to be held soon for a constitutional, for a legislature. And that would be a bicameral legislature that was going to be kind of modeled on an American example. But you asked about Yuan Shikai. I mean, yes, he does get compared to George Washington, but I think it's a superficial comparison. The comparison is really that he was a military man who takes political office to help birth a new republic. And honestly, it's the loyalty of the troops that help him to succeed. And in those areas, Washington is a decent comparison. One of the big changes, and all apologies, I spent some of Thanksgiving weekend listening to Hamilton with my daughters, is that, Washington is very clear that he's not going to continue to serve indefinitely. And in fact, and I'm not that kind of a historian, but in fact, Washington is offered the chance to become king. And he says no. He says that's not what the Republic stands for. Yuan Shikai definitely doesn't have that opinion. Yuan Shikai, and we can get there in a couple of minutes, but Yuan Shikai, when push comes to shove, he very happily would be king. In fact, king might seem a little modest for him. He would prefer to be an emperor, and that's where he goes.
Well, that does remind me of somebody. Before we discuss the sort of mechanism of how he accumulated power, can you take the story on a little further? What happened in the subsequent years?
Sure. So as I said, in the spring of 1912, they arranged that there's going to have to be elections. And so those elections take place in the fall. And the winner of those elections is the party that's going to become the Kuomintang. In fact, the Kuomintang is the political party that emerges out of the revolutionary organization, the anti-Qing organization that Sun Yat-sen had established. But Sun Yat-sen is actually not the person doing the political legwork. That's a man named Song Jiaoren. And Song Jiaoren is the leader of what's going to be the Kuomintang. He's the one who's running a lot of the campaigns, and he helps for Kuomintang candidates to win the elections that mean that the parliament is going to be controlled by this opposition party to Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai has made very clear that he doesn't really believe in the notion of political parties, but he certainly doesn't believe in the notion of a political opposition within the government. Political pluralism is not part of his vocabulary. So when it becomes clear that the Kuomintang is going to be in control of the parliament, and then it becomes clear that Song Jiaoren is a capable and charismatic and politically canny operator who's going to represent either, if not a counterbalance, at least a challenge to Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai has...
a threat, really, is what you're saying.
Yes, and how much of a threat we'll never know, because Song Jiaoren is assassinated. He's murdered on the train platform in Shanghai in the spring of 1913, almost certainly under orders from Yuan Shikai. The people who carried out the assassination, both themselves in kind of Jack Ruby fashion, both wind up being killed themselves before we can really get to the bottom of what happened.
And they knife him, do they?
They shoot him. He's shot.
They shoot him. That's right. They shoot him.
He's shot on the train platform. Yep.
And he dies on the platform.
He dies a couple days later. And in fact, he dies, he gets taken to hospital, he lingers on for a couple of days. And in fact, he writes a note to Yuan Shikai. And when he writes, obviously, translation, says, I humbly hope that Your Excellency, to Yuan Shikai, that Your Excellency will champion honesty, propagate justice, and promote democracy. That was his wish for the Chinese Republic, and that is absolutely not what happens. So Yuan Shikai continues to consolidate power after Song's death. Sun Yat-sen declares a second revolution because he sees how things are going off the rails, and that fails. And then when faced with that chaos, Yuan Shikai decides what we need is not more revolution, what we need is a new emperor, and declares himself to be not content with being president. He decides to be emperor. He declares himself emperor. Actually, I shouldn't say he declares himself emperor. He asks Parliament to consider a resolution as to whether or not they want Yuan Shikai to become emperor, and there's a vote. And the vote is very close. It's 1,993 to 0 in favor of asking Yuan Shikai to become emperor. And at that point, everything falls apart even further.
Clearly, that vote was completely voluntary and expressed the will of the people.
I think free and fair is the word you're looking for, Jeremy.
Right.
Yeah, but as you can imagine, now everybody is annoyed. I mean, annoyed is a bit of an understatement. So now the monarchists, they're mad at Yuan Shikai because he ultimately was the person who ensured the demise of the Qing dynasty, who saw an end to the monarchy. The Republicans are unhappy because they see that Yuan does not really have democratic principles at heart. In fact, at the first opportunity, he's going to not only eliminate political opposition, but he's going to accrue to himself the not just the trappings, but the titles of autocracy. And then he dies of unrelated causes. He dies of illness. China really doesn't manage to have political stability again for decades.
Really, until the communists take over in 1949, no one who's in control of the whole territory of what is China today.
Yeah, with occasional and regional exceptions, there's really not a centralized, stable political authority from 1915 until 1949.
Okay, so I think we've told the story of Yuan. So let's try and understand some things about his rise and, I mean, he didn't really fall, but his rise and his perhaps destruction of hopes of democracy in China. Was there something in how he accumulated power or in the response of people around him, Chinese elites, that made what happened the lurch to his imperial ambitions to real authoritarianism? Was that sort of inevitable? Or were there things, do you think, that could have gone differently that would have led China to have something of a democracy that could have survived on beyond the 20s? And of course, I realize I'm asking you a ridiculous question as a historian too, but is there something that looks to you in hindsight that, well, if Song Jiaoren hadn't been assassinated and, he was organizing from abroad, I mean, was there sufficient strength there in other organizations or in institutions to have allowed for hope to preserve democracy?
Well, I mean, for sure. I mean, I think, and look, we see this a lot in a lot of different contexts. There's an argument between the moderates and the extremists, whether you're going in either way. And from the argument is, well, you need to be more moderate to build a broader base so that you can ensure maximum buy-in. And then you have some other groups that are going to say you need to, the moderates are actually giving away the principles that we need to hew to in order to make meaningful change. And that's very much what's going on in those early years of the Republic. So I alluded to a little bit before that there were much more progressive planks in the Kuomintang coalition. Women were given the right to vote in many versions of the Kuomintang platform. You were going to have much more of welfare state, and some would actually just say socialism in other platforms, other planks in that platform. You were going to broaden the franchise in a way that you weren't just giving power to slightly more people than had power under a monarchy. So all of these planks were there, and that was what a lot of people who were building the Constitution felt was necessary. And while I do think that Song Jiaoren's assassination is a major blow to democracy in China, it has to be recognized that Song Jiaoren was the politician who saw the elimination of women's suffrage as part of the Constitution, who saw the elimination of a lot of these social welfare aspects of the new Constitution, who saw the narrowing of the franchise rather than a broadening of the franchise. And perhaps, we'll never know, had he lived, he might have then taken the political power he was building by kind of compromising with some of the elites. He might have been able to use that power to challenge Yuan Shikai and then to move China into a democracy. I think it can't be overstated enough just how fragile this democracy is. It's only been around for a few months after centuries and some would say millennia of monarchic rule.
Or perhaps power would have gone to his head and things would have been even worse, I suppose.
It's also possible. So I do think that the two great counterexamples are the obvious one, which is if Song Jiaoren hadn't been assassinated, then you would have had a democratic politician who could challenge Yuan Shikai, and China might have been able to move to a more Republican form of government. I think the other counterexample, though, is what if either Song Jiaoren or others in the Kuomintang coalition had insisted and said, what we need to do is broaden the base of power, and we need to broaden participation in government. And so if we had people who didn't own property, for instance, if you had women, if you had more than the 10% of the population able to vote, then people might have cared, because that's the other big factor, is when Yuan Shikai declares himself emperor, 90% of the people didn't have any say whether he was an emperor, whether he was president, whether he was any of those things. What's the difference? It doesn't really matter.
Right. The democracy wasn't a real democracy. It didn't involve all of the people, just a tiny minority. But of course, I mean, the context for that, I mean, was it only 1911? I think New Zealand was the first country in the world to give women the right to vote. So, for them to have extended the franchise would have been, on a global level, remarkable, wouldn't it?
I would say, depending on how you want to frame it, you could either say this was in the air, like, this is the moment that societies were considering women's suffrage. Or you could say, yeah, this would have been ahead of the curve. It would have beat the United States by a few years. It would have beaten Great Britain by a few years. It was early in this kind of global movement for democracies to enfranchise women.
Right. And I suppose sometimes countries somehow manage to leap ahead. So you talk about Yuan's cultivation of personal loyalty on his way up. And, how important is that pattern, I suppose, for Yuan and for other authoritarian leaders, personal loyalty rather than institutions ensuring things get done? And how much do you see of, maybe the real question is, how much do you think with Yuan Shikai did you see of the type of thing you see with Trump, where you have kooks and loons and incompetence, whose very weakness possibly is a virtue because they couldn't get any other job and are 100% beholden to Trump? I mean, I think that's a phenomenon that people like Hannah Arendt have documented about authoritarians, that, it doesn't matter if someone is competent or not, as long as they're loyal. How is Yuan Shikai in terms of his style of cultivating loyalty?
Yeah, I think Yuan Shikai I don't think he's exceptional. I don't think like he's a really comic book figure. I think he accumulated loyalty through the military, and right in the military, just to play historian for a minute, like this goes back, people like Philip Kuhn, late Harvard historian Philip Kuhn, looked at sort of what emerged in China after the Taiping Rebellion. And it really is a sort of militarization of society, that the importance of military connections and of militarism becomes particularly important as institutions, as civilian democratic institutions weaken in the course of the 19th century. It's obviously not a democracy, but you do have broad, like, public participation in lots of different institutions. That becomes weaker in the late Qing dynasty. And so these military connections become more and more important. And the most important ones are the most powerful ones. And that's why Yuan Shikai is the most powerful, because he's up near the top of the Qing army. Then you have those that, and this is why your question is a good one, it is about personal loyalty. It's not about institutional loyalty. And so when the Qing dynasty falls, a lot of people are willing to still support the new government because they don't see themselves as supporting a different government. They still see themselves as supporting Yuan Shikai, or supporting the person who is in charge of their unit, of their division, of their army, whatever it may be. And then what happens when Yuan Shikai dies and he has a successor, there's a new president that goes in, but it doesn't much matter, because that loyalty is not to the office of the president. It's not to the Republic of China. It's to the person who they're reporting to. And so I mentioned a few minutes ago that Warlord Era, what it means is that people are loyal to personal armies. And so you have these dozens of different armies, some are the size of a large city, some are the size of a small country, some are the size of a medium-sized country, just all across China. And China is divided into these different units, which are fighting with each other with no regard to any particular agenda. Some are relatively democratic, some are completely autocratic, some are trying to convert people to Christianity, some are trying to bring on the millennium, some are trying to just collect trophies, whether it's people or treasure or opportunity. It just, maybe this is to your point of the kind of the grifters or the incompetents. Once the center falls apart, then anybody who can get a hold of enough guns, they can have their own little microstate. And those microstates are sometimes pretty absurd, dangerous places. But it really is all just about personal loyalty. And that's caused by Yuan Shikai. He himself wasn't particularly, I don't think, incompetent. He made some bad choices, to be sure. But the people who came in his wake, because he had failed to promote institutions, I think that really is what sets China back for decades, because it's just not able to centralize.
Right. I suppose that might be a parallel that strikes me with, what we're going to deal with in the years to come in the United States, with all the expertise having been wrenched out of the US government. It's going to take a long time to fix. But another question that does also have relevance to the United States, but is also global, is Yuan's sort of public endorsement of republicanism and, dismissing monarchy rumors is even as he was, eliminating or marginalizing opponents. And, this type of double speak and double game obviously is a common feature of authoritarians. I mean, I think every country that's ever had democratic in its country name is a place where you mostly get shot if you speak your mind. So, but how did it function with Yuan, this sort of talking up a sort of image of democracy while actually doing the other thing?
Yeah, I think it's a few different possibilities. So, he had a Columbia University professor who was advising him, right, on how his government might go forward. And he actually was, Frank Goodnow was his name. He actually was not in favor of this move to democracy. He thought that this move away from monarchy was not a bad move in and of itself, but it was much too rapid. And so that this change from, to use the cliche, thousands of years of history, and then all of a sudden you turn it on its head and make it into democracy. I think that played some role in Yuan changing his tune. I don't know if he was cynically calculating that I'm going to use the terminology of democracy, but all along I'm going to be cultivating personal power. My own thought is that he kind of really he couldn't really imagine anything that was different than a monarchy. And so kind of the latest fashion was for a republic, and this Republican revolution was going to change the people at the top. And whether it's called a president or it's called an emperor, or it's called something else, I don't think that emotionally, to just really go outside of my lane, that he could really understand the idea that you would have something other than a single man at the head of the government.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I kind of think.
Yeah, that does make sense. To go back to the guy you mentioned, Frank Goodnow, the Columbia professor, that's an interesting character. Can you say a little bit more about him? I mean, from what I've read in your writings about him and my imaginings, he sounds like a sort of, I don't know, something like a Jeffrey Sachs kind of American going around meddling in other countries because he thinks he has a good theory about how they should be run. Or how would you characterize him?
Sure. I mean, he's an interesting for listeners who go to the APSA conference every Labor Day, the American Political Science Association. He was the first president of APSA. I mean, he was an academic. He'd been in a lot of different important American universities, including Johns Hopkins. He was president of Johns Hopkins. But I think his work when he was at Columbia, it was mainly about trying to advise other states on this sort of transition to democracy, transition to sort of Republican forms of government. And it was coming from a place of, and again, this is outside of my lane, but what I would say is that it was really about this is the inevitable movement of human societies is toward this more modern form of government. And so it wasn't that you sort of had a moral imperative toward democracy. It was that this is like the old monarchy is old, republicanism, democracy is new. Eventually, all societies are going to modernize and they're going to implicitly westernize. They're going to become more like the United States and Europe, and how they're going to go about doing that. So I think he was really about imparting wisdom.
But there's going to be a middle step in this case between the empire and a kingdom, essentially a monarchy.
Yeah.
Right. That kind of thinking wasn't even strange, as recently as the 1980s. I used to hear a lot of that kind of thinking in South Africa, explaining why South Africa couldn't be democratic immediately, and the idea that there had to be a historical stage.
For sure. And the other thing that I think just to me said is like Goodnow was a racist. I mean, let's also keep that in mind.
He was a racist.
Yeah, I say that clinically, like that pejoratively.
Yes, like the people who were telling me that in the 1980s in South Africa. Same.
Right.
Yeah.
So he was very much on the idea that like races were divided in terms of their capabilities, and that he's very much a fan of the white man's birth.
And the inferior races needed time to sort of progress right to Western Enlightenment. Yeah. Well, those ideas are as repulsive as they are now were not at all unusual. I mean, my grandmother held such ideas, so one of them, I think. Bless her heart, as they say.
Yes, as they say, exactly right.
So whatever you think about his intentions, I mean, he did go through a fairly elaborate sort of quasi-democratic theater to become emperor. He didn't just declare himself emperor. He rigged up a national representative assembly. I mean, how did he give his coronation as emperor a sort of democratic process, a veneer?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've already alluded to it. Like, it's an interesting case. I mean, if you compare it to some other things going on in the world, like he had a military power to enforce his rule. Maybe not for the long term, but he certainly could get done what he wanted to get done because he had control of the military. So he could have simply declared himself to be emperor and been done with it. Now, it might have gone very badly, but he could have done that. By having the assembly vote for him, that does try to give it this veneer of democracy. But then at the same time, by saying that it was almost 2,000 to nothing, that not a single person voted against him, also kind of gives the lie to any sort of notion this was a legitimate political process. So, I mean, I guess, and this actually wasn't where I started the conversation, but I think this is kind of worth considering, is I think that he was kind of a pathetic figure in a lot of ways, and that felt he had paid his dues in this monarchic system, and that now he had finally played his cards in such a way that he was going to get to hold real power. But it turns out that times had changed, and no longer was it possible for just a humble young military man from North China. His aspirations of being emperor couldn't be realized because of this pesky new democracy thing. And so he wound up not being able to do it. I mean, it falls apart through incompetence. So, I mean, I said earlier that I didn't think he was comically incompetent. I don't think he was comically incompetent. I think it would take great political skill to navigate your way through that particular moment, and he didn't have it.
Right. Yeah. When you say pathetic figure, that does recall, I think, the most famous photo of him sort of dressed up in this ridiculous military uniform with all kinds of medals hanging from him. He looks like some kind of demented child from a rich Victorian family.
No, the idea that he would have to do something was not really part of his portfolio.
Yeah. He would be the power. He would be the state. He wouldn't have to actually get anything done. So one of the sort of curiously sort of contemporary details of the story of Yuan Shikai is his what you might call astroturfing campaign in his campaign to present his becoming emperor as democratic. Can you talk a little bit about what he did to sort of, again, give the appearance that there were large groups of ordinary people who supported him?
Absolutely. That's a good point. And so I mentioned before the leading up to the voting 1,993, I think it was, to 0 to become emperor. But it wasn't just that simple. He had also had his finance minister, a man named Liang, but he had Liang Shiri. He had him organize groups. I mean, astroturfing, for those who don't recall, so astroturfing is the idea that you have grassroots support. And we have that metaphor suggesting that it comes up from the bottom. Astroturfing is when you make it appear that you have grassroots support, but it's actually put in artificially from above.
Like AstroTurf, which is the fake lawn used on American football fields.
Exactly. So there was an organization of rickshaw pullers. There was an organization of Confucian scholars. There were women for Yuan Shikai. There was a beggars guild that was all supporting Yuan Shikai. And Liang Shi had financed all of these groups and organized them so that they would be clamoring for Yuan Shikai to become emperor. And then that was expressed through the public will and the assembly, leading to this unanimous vote in favor of him becoming it. So I do think that in a lot of different places you can see, and this is a moment, I mean, we see it in different places, democracy is fragile. Sometimes democracies that are a couple hundred years old are suddenly very fragile. This one was only a couple dozen months old, and it was brand new. And so you could take these democratic institutions and manipulate them pretty easily to give the appearance of popular support when in fact they're really just supporting the interests of a very few or even a single person.
And I suppose you don't have to convince everybody or even anybody. You just have to give people sufficient reason not to worry too much, or sufficient reason to kind of paper over or ignore their instinctive objections to some kind of power takeover. I guess I'm trying to understand, like, what is the purpose in something like that, where he already had essentially the votes he needed, if you want to put it in today's terms, but he still had to also make it. It was like he already knew he was going to win the election, but he also needed to organize like a Trump rally kind of thing with a lot of people to make it look more solid.
Yeah, I think that it may be that one of the problems with democracies from an authoritarian point of view is that you have to keep doing it over again. So Yuan Shikai had come to power, but somehow he now had to confront the idea that, well, would someone else come to power? Would he lose power potentially? If there was an election, that meant there would be another election, and that election might not go the way that he wanted it to. And so I think that he was sensitive to that. There are also people in his cabinet who were encouraging to restore democracy, and those were some of the people who were involved in this astroturfing campaign to try to muster up popular support. It's an open question as to whether or not Yuan Shikai decided, I want to be emperor, give me the mechanism by which I can legitimize that. or whether he was truly persuaded that China couldn't handle a democracy and needed to have an authoritarian centralized system, and that he was the person who was going to do that. I don't know that it matters, but you could interpret that in either way as to how he was running it. But one thing that he didn't do is he didn't trust democracy to look out for his own future, and probably not for China's future, though I don't know that the latter was that important to him.
Right. In any event, I mean, he doesn't seem to be somebody who was ever driven by a particular vision for how China should be, compared to those around him, people like Sun Yat-sen or Sung Dao-ren. He wasn't at all a man who was driven by vision. He was a man who came to power because he was a military man and stayed in power because he had a lust for power. He didn't ever present the people of China with a sort of compelling vision for what their future should look like, did he?
No, there was never any other alternative. I mean, it would be something very similar to what the Qing dynasty had been, except with a republic and a president, an emperor.
And no plan for succession.
No, and no plan for succession. And obviously, when succession became possible, Song Jiawen was assassinated, and he did away with the presidency.
Right. To talk about that assassination, I mean, he could have done something else. I think we may have mentioned that earlier. He could have tried to eliminate Song through some other means. Does it reveal anything about authoritarian psychology that he couldn't conceive of an alternative means of eliminating, the risk to himself of Song Jiawen, or that he couldn't tolerate the thought of losing power?
Yeah, I think that it's two things. I think it's one, this is the easiest mechanism, like most straightforward mechanism to eliminate his opposition is to have him killed.
Shoot him.
That was done pretty easily.
Tried and tested, worked for thousands of years.
Exactly. The other thing, though, I think is relevant is whether he's sincere or not. Yuan Shikai and many authoritarians talk about like instability is itself the threat to stability. It's kind of a corollary to the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. Like the problem with instability is that it's not stable. So what he wants to do is he feels that if you're going to have elections, you're going to have politicking. I mean, all of this is, again, brand new. I said earlier that emotionally he couldn't really wrap his mind around that. The idea that you would have a society, even if it's only 10% of the people who you're actually talking to, if you're going to have a society that's going to go through this sort of negotiation and this uncertainty, I mean, this has been something that as a servant of the Qing dynasty, he would have been very acutely aware of the dangers of a mismanaged succession. And so if he sees that regardless of who's going to succeed him, if there's uncertainty about succession, that's a bad thing in and of itself. So he decides to eliminate that. And if there's no rival, then there's no uncertainty about succession.
Right. But then, of course, he dies.
He dies unexpectedly, and his successor does not have the personal loyalty or charisma that Sun Yat-sen had. And so things fall apart. And there's no democratic tradition. There are no democratic institutions to speak of. And so that's where it's left. In some ways, it's not surprising in any way that things devolved that way so quickly.
Right. Whereas the United States, I mean, the institutions, many of them are hollowed out or, even have their name changed. We're recording this on December the 4th. And I just read that Trump changed the name of the U.S. Institute of Peace to like the Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace. So, yeah, but on that subject, a final question for you, Jay, because this has been, I think, a great introduction to Yuan Shikai and some things to think about in relation to our own times. But how is it being at a university in 2025 in the United States?
It's difficult. I mean, I think higher education in the US had already been facing a number of challenges. One had been demographic changes, so that especially I'm in the Northeast, and especially there, you're seeing a decline in the number of high school graduates, which traces back to the 2008 financial crisis. So we're already looking at more challenging numbers for students. We're looking at really a sea change in public opinion polling about the value of a college degree in the United States is just completely turned on its head in 10 years. Ever since World War II, there's been a clear majority of people thought that college education was worth the investment. And now a majority of people, this NBC poll that came out last week suggested that about 2/3 don't.
They'd rather have a ChatGPT subscription.
Could be. But then the other thing, and this is what ties into the podcast, is, there's political pressure. The idea as I look around, and it's not in my part of the country so much, but You look in some parts of the country where the governors or the legislatures are insisting on dictating curriculum and dictating class content. And obviously the Trump administration has sued, for the most part unsuccessfully from a legal standpoint, but often successfully in terms of getting institutions to pay money or to agree to certain changes. So those kinds of threats to honestly one of the most important institutions in the country. I mean, American higher education has been one of its most successful exports and models for a long time. And so that's really been a challenge to see those kinds of institutions being fundamentally threatened for economic reasons, for political reasons, and for demographic reasons.
Yes. Well, I guess. What can I say?
Do you feel better now?
Yeah, I feel great. Maybe we should go back to the Qing dynasty, talk about somebody else's problems 100 years ago.
That was what Yuan Shikai thought too.
He had a point. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by Maria Repnikova and me, Jeremy Goldkorn. This show is edited by Cadra Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Goodnow by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Liu Fei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to support us, take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jay. That was a lot of fun.